13th, 2008, and we're talking with Francis Goodman Golman.
Right.
And what is your address here?
Here,
Mm-hmm.
6335 West Northwest Highway, Suite 511.
Okay, and how do you like to be referred to?
Francis.
Just Francis, okay. And where, when you were very young, where did you live?
My parents' first home was on Fluoride Street. At the present time, that's the home of the Valor Hospital Children's Medical Center. And it's on Hall and Fluoride Street. We moved from there to Maple Avenue, 2912 Maple Avenue, across from the Stoneleigh Hotel. The Stoneleigh Hotel was not built when we moved there, but it was built during the first year or so that we lived there. And it was a fourplex, which my dad built, and we lived there till I was 6 years old.
Do you remember the dates?
That we moved there?
Yeah.
No, I do not.
Up until you were there till 6 years old, so what day did you move?
We moved from there to 2711 South Boulevard. My mother wanted us to move to a neighborhood where we could be with Jewish children, and at that time Dallas only had, I think, 4 synagogues. Shereth Israel was it wasn't conservative in those years. Shereth Israel, the Romanish Shul on Park Road, Temple Emmanuel, and Tifereth Israel. Tifereth Israel at that time was in North Dallas, which shortly after they moved on Grand Avenue.
Do you remember what year you moved to South Boulevard?
Well, I was in the first grade, I think, so I'm 85 years old.
So that would be about 20...
Let's see. It was 1929, I think.
Now, when you lived on Maple, was that, at that point in time, close to where Little Jerusalem or Goose Valley was?
Yes, it was.
Do you remember those days?
Vaguely. I can remember going to the synagogue over there, which I think was out near Wolf Street, and whatever the street... Oh, and my grandparents, my father's parents lived on Lake Street, which is no longer there. We had no Jewish neighbors. Across the street, at that time, the mayor of Dallas lived, Hugh Bradford. His claim to fame was his daughter was married to Joe Reichman, the orchestra leader.
That's interesting. Joe Reichman was Jewish.
I know. Well, I know, because we used to play back and forth across the street. He had a son, Mayor Bradford, who was my age.
Now, are you first generation to come to Dallas, or born in Dallas?
I was born in Dallas. My father was born in Poland, Mizrich, Poland, which is no longer on the map. My mother was born in New York.
How did you know how they happened to come to Dallas?
My mother's father died. She was 11 years old. She had an older brother and an older sister who lived in New York. And her next sister in age was, you might even remember her, Rosie Book. Do you remember her?
Vaguely.
She had a delicatessen downtown on Irving Street. And she got married to Louis Venner. He came to New York. Somebody made a shelter in those days. And she had 2 children. She lived on Ackerd Street. The house is still there. Dr. Can lived next door. And so when my mother's father died, my mother and her mother came to Dallas and lived with my aunt and her husband.
You said they had a house on Ackerd Street. About what area of Ackerd Street? What was the cross street?
I can't recall. Do you know what that street is, Annette? Where Harry Kaplan's place, it's the next block. I don't know. It went into Irving Street, I think. I don't recall that name of that street.
Was that considered part of the Cedars neighborhood at that time? Do you know?
Not exactly. Up further on Irving Street, going south, the Sangers lived. Quite a few Reformed Jewish people, and that was a different world. And my aunt and uncle Archie and Sarah Goodman lived there. Felice Mursky's mother lived on around the corner there, the Apoys, and there was a Jewish family that lived next door to my aunt. I don't recall their name until yesterday. I probably did. And also the Freeds lived on that same block.
What do you happen to know what brought your father to Dallas and what year he came in?
He came in about 1915. I think he was 15 years old. And there were 5 brothers and 2 sisters in the family. One of the sisters was already married. So the oldest 2 brothers, I don't know how they came to Dallas. The oldest 2 brothers, and I just found this out a couple of years ago, came to New York first, and how they got to Dallas, I do not know. Mm-hmm. The rest of the brothers and sisters came through Galveston. And that it is a shame we didn't find out about those things. I know that growing up in Poland, like all the others, they were very poor and worked very hard and most anxious to come to America so they could have a better life. And my father was 21 years old when he got married. And in the beginning, he worked for the Brown Cracker and Candy Company, which was on Lamar Street, which prompted him to learn how to be a really good cook, make beautiful sandwiches, omelets, and things like that. He loved to do that. And then he bought a horse and a wagon and became a fruit and vegetable peddler, and worked in the Park Cities. His brothers all did the same, but he must have been the most affluent of the brothers, except the youngest brother. The youngest brother was Max Goodman, and when he came here, he was able to go to SMU to school. And the Harris family that owned A. Harris's practically adopted him, and immediately, in a short period of time, he became vice president. That's a big store in those days. They took him everywhere they went, to the opera, to the symphony. He became really educated and cultured through them, and he was a lovely, fine man.
About what year or what era was that?
Must have been about, I was born in 1923. Must have been just before that time. I think maybe a year or two, one way or the other. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he remained with the company until they closed.
Do you happen to know about when your dad started peddling with the vegetables and fruits?
Well, right after they first got married. The first thing he did when he got married was bought a little house, cost $5,000, and he borrowed the money, and I have the letter from the man he borrowed the money in that chest there, and in good faith told him that he would pay it out and pay it back. And the letter refers to how honest my dad was and what a gentleman, and how much he enjoyed doing business with him, and wished him the best of luck in his future.
Where was that house?
On Floride Street.
That was on
That was their first house.
Mm-hmm.
Then when they moved on Maple Avenue, he got a truck and had a better route. And all the ladies, including the first Mrs. Thornton, and the bank, different people from the bank, always waited for Mr. Goodman to come. And they called him by that and gave him the right stature that he deserved. Mm-hmm.
Now, did he deliver in the neighborhoods?
Yes.
How did he
daily.
function.
I don't know which places he went to. Then as his business grew, SMU was his first big customer, and I do remember he used to take me with him on Saturday night, where Dallas Hall is now, was the only building there at that time, and sit me on the table in the kitchen, and the chef, who was a big, fine-looking black man, gave me a bowl of strawberries or whatever he had made that day, and my dad took his order for him for the week and then delivered it at the time designated by the chef. Then as times got better, he serviced Dunton's cafeteria. Mr. Dunton and he were good friends. My dad didn't have any problem with being Jewish, and he was a good friend of padres in the church and sisters at the convent there on Turtle Creek Boulevard. I'm not sure whether that's still there or not. It's right there as you enter the city of Dallas on Turtle Creek. And then he bought a building on Cadiz Street, and he was there, and his clientele grew, and several Jewish men worked for him in various stages in the office. Some very successful young men who are now deceased worked in his office. They graduated from SMU, worked for him when they went to school, and worked for him until they were established themselves in business.
Do you know about the year he bought the building on Cadiz Street?
1923. I'm not really positive. If I'd known you were going to ask me these questions, I'd have looked into it.
We can get back to
like
it.
a lot of other people, they don't know from whence they came.
Right.
I think that is because most of the Jews coming from Poland and those countries had such a hard life, they didn't want to talk about it, and they didn't. None of his brothers did, and they all raised good families. They all went to college, their children, and of course they're all deceased now, and have been for many years. I think Uncle Max was the last one who died. He was the youngest one in the family.
How was it when you moved to South Boulevard?
Well, when we moved to South Boulevard, the reason we moved to that part of town, as I told you, is my mother wanted us to get a Hebrew education, a Hebrew school. And we used to go to a little town, it's still there, and in operation, Marlin, Texas, where she used to take my grandmother. My grandmother, her mother, Anna Solomon, lived with my mother and dad from the day she got married till the day she died, that my mother married till the day that my grandmother died. And in Marlin, in the bathhouse, my mother met Ronnie Hoppenstein, who was the mother of Manuel Hoppenstein, a prominent young Dallas lawyer. At that time, he was going to law school, and Mrs. Hoppenstein talked to my mother about moving in the area where her brother-in-law, Rabbi Abramowitz, had just taken a new synagogue. I think he was the first rabbi there. I know he did not speak English. He gave his sermons in Yiddish. And so I would think I was about 8 or 10, something like that. And of course we went to Hebrew school, and then they established the Herzl Heikel Hebrew School at the Agudas Achim. It was quite orthodox, and most of the old-timers. And at that time the temple did not have a Sunday school. So there are many families, not too many of them still left, whose mothers went to the temple, and the fathers went to the shul. Some of them went to the Romanische shul. But many of the prominent Jewish families, the fathers went to the Agudas Achim, and the mothers went to the temple, and so in turn the children went to Sunday school, especially the girls, at temple. I don't know if you had to be a member in those days or not, but there was no, in my time as a child, mixing. I was about 14 years old the first time I went into the temple. Well, not into the temple proper, because I took dancing lessons. They had a class there. And that teacher about 3 years ago died. Her name was Margie Novich, and she married one of the Cohen brothers. And they had other classes there. And Mrs. Abramowitz, as a matter of fact, taught Mrs. Lefkowitz, Rabbi Lefkowitz's wife, to read Yiddish and Hebrew, and she in turn taught Mrs. Abramowitz to speak English and write English. And Rabbi Lefkowitz and Rabbi Abramowitz were very dear friends, and they did the same for each other. It was certainly a different world then.
Yeah. What about the women and the neighbors on the block and
the block that we lived on, 2700 and 2600, were together.
Mm-hmm.
Today they are the historical blocks in South Dallas. Mm-hmm. On my side of the street, there was a very religious family that lived there. They were from Tulsa. Their name was Travis, and they eventually moved back because Dallas was just not religious enough for them. They had 8 children. A couple of the sons became rabbis, and the daughters married rabbis. I think one daughter was my age, and she married a rabbi and lived in Israel. And a few other, I would say, Orthodox families. On the other side, a couple of houses down the street, there were a few Sheriff Israel families on there. And the Reform Jews were ultra-Reform. They never spoke to my mother. Not that, I don't know why, because she was too religious for them. They used to see her walking to, I shouldn't say this probably,
no,
but it's
fine.
Absolutely a fact.
No, that's fine.
They would see her walking to shul on Shabbos with my grandmother, and my brother always walked with them. And across the street lived a very prominent family his father was the first president of Sheriff Israel. They were very ultra-Reform, and the rest of the Reform Jews were ultra-Reform. I don't know whether they're children, I don't recall, and I don't know that I ever knew if they went to religious school, which they called Sunday school in those days. But they certainly did not mix with each other. And our next-door neighbor was a particularly warm, friendly, good neighbor, kind to my mother. My mother was very young, and my dad had worked hard, and at that age of his life, they had a magnificent home with beautiful furnishings, Oriental rugs, made on the premises, help all the time. None of those folks had that, but it didn't keep them from keeping their nose up in the air. Mm-hmm. Years later, many years later, I'd see one of them and they'd say, "How is your dear mother?" That was about 40 years later. That's the way it was. I imagine it was the same in other communities, I think.
But now you mentioned the fact that the women, many of them went to temple, and the husbands were still Orthodox or conservative. Well, where was the conservative aspect of that?
And and with those women, they also kept kosher homes. But I imagine that was because the husbands, I'm not going to use the word demand, but it required it, wanted it. And the children, I know several women today, just slightly younger than I, who went to Sunday school at Temple. The fathers went to Sheriff Israel, and 2 or 3 other families. As a matter of fact, my mother became the co-chairman of the First Women's Division with Reba Wadle. And they selected my mother because she was from the religious group. And I really believe who was instrumental in getting her interested in working was Morris Jaffe, who was a very young man at the time. And he was busy in the Federation, I think they still called it that in those Jewish Federation.
About what year was that?
I'm not sure. I would say I was about 15 or 16. I think that was about the time. And she was active, did a lot of things, and different members of the family participated. I went on the first women's mission to Israel with Fanny Shannon. And from Dallas, Jan Barron and Knopf, can't think of her first name. Her husband was an attorney. And we were the only women from Dallas. There were about 200 women who went on that mission.
You remember the year or the era?
I was about 19. That was about 1972, I think. When did Israel become a state?
48. 1948.
It was long after that. It was the first women's mission from the United States. And I know there were 200 women.
Now, were these women from the Reform group when they married, or were they from an Orthodox conservative?
On this mission, you mean?
No, I want to go back to the women that went to temple. I mean, how is it that they...
No, I think they mostly came from synagogues at that time. I'm not too positive. I guess if I sat down and analyzed, I could figure it out.
Sure.
Now, I know a couple of our cousins, of my husband's cousins, went to temple. The mother went to temple. The father went to Tifereth Israel. Another one of my present-day friends, her mother went to temple. Her father went to Agudas Achim. And another one of my cousins, the mother and children went to temple, and the father went to, I think he went to the North Dallas, Tifereth Israel show.
What about your Jewish... Now, let's go back to your family and immediate family and what have you. What was the extent of your Jewish education?
I went to Hebrew school at the Herzl Heikel Hebrew School, which was a part of the Agudas Achim that was built and given to the Agudas Achim synagogue by Mr. Jaffe, the father, I can't recall his name, and his brother-in-law, Mr. Kaplan, his wife's brother. And I went to Hebrew school until I went to college, which was when I was about 18 years old.
Had you mentioned that, if I understood you correctly, that you had gone to Hebrew school even before the Herzl Heikel developed their school? Did I not understand that?
Well, yes, they had a Hebrew school in the Agudas Achim.
They did? Okay.
Of course, it's nothing like it is today. The children learn so much. And looking back, the important thing, you went to Hebrew school, to a really serious Hebrew school, was that we didn't learn to translate that. And I feel like that's a really big loss. I don't even think they do that a lot today. They understand the prayers because they're described to them, but I don't think they can read Hebrew and translate into English. I could be wrong. I'm not an authority. I don't know.
What did you learn? What was the program at Herzl Heikel?
Well, we learned the prayers that were important to everyday life. Till this day, I say the Modeh Ani when I open my eyes in the morning. And if I fall asleep at night and don't say the Shema, I always wake up and say it during the night. Wasn't a great deal of emphasis, but we went. We had to go. There was no question. They had a large enrollment, and I know at the what they call your Hebrew school?
Hebrew School of Dallas.
And of course they had a more extensive program and had more qualified teachers. Mr. Levine himself. Then as years went by, they had better teachers at Herzl Heikel.
Did you learn to read Hebrew? Did you learn the alphabet?
Yes.
Did you learn to write cursive?
Not much. A little bit. Not much. There was a lot lacking, but they made a tremendous, I think, step forward and trying to do the best that they could with the material that they had. For example, when I was 16, I taught Sunday school. What did I know about teaching Sunday school? They gave me a book. I read the story. Children told it back. And so did other people whose children went to Sunday school there, whose parents were active.
And this was part of a Agudas Achim?
Yes.
And were your parents involved in?
My mother was president of the Ladies' Auxiliary for forever. And after I was married and we came home, we got settled into a little house on Park Row. Mother said, Francis, it's time for you to be president of the sisterhood. They called it Ladies Auxiliary then. I said, I can't do that. I was only about 24 years old. I said, it's too early for me. She says, you have to do it. There's no one else to do it. So I did it for about 8 years, I guess, and stayed active as long as the synagogue was there. Tried to keep then as people began moving out of the neighborhood, it was hard to get them to come back to the services there. And when they finally closed the synagogue, I was married then. It was after I was married. I was 19 when I was married, and I had been away at college a couple of years and so forth. And then my family came to Cherith, Israel with my husband, Joe, and I. And on the last rolls at Cherith, Israel, it's not the last rolls now, but it was then.
Right.
As time went on, were my parents. Joe's dad had already passed away. He was a very young man, 52 years old when he died. And my brother and his wife and 5 children, and my sister and her husband, and 4 children, and Joe and I and 4 children. And we still sit in the same seats, although my sister and her husband go to the temple and live in California most of the time.
About what year was that now that you're talking about?
That was when Cherith, Israel first moved onto
where we are now.
Where we are now.
50s.
What was it?
56, I believe.
56, I think that's about right. And of course, other members of our family. We had several different members in our family. President Jake Golman, Julius Coleman, my husband, Joe Golman. I think that was about it. And basically, most of the family, Golman family, has remained, except a very few.
Now, where did you go to grammar school?
John Henry Brown School, where you went.
I went to Colonial.
Oh, you did? How come?
We moved on Park Row
After?
in 1942. I
Oh.
just finished Colonial
I
and
could
went
see
into
you
Forest
running
High.
around down the street, across
Right.
the street. You live next door to the Greens and the Levines,
Next to the Adlons.
the Avalons.
2517
Well,
Park
in that
Row.
area, right on the corner.
Across from the Rubenets.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Now, after you finished Brown School,
I went to Forest Avenue High School.
and then from Forest High,
I went to the University of Colorado, and then the war came. My dad made me come home because my brother had gone into the Army. He was stationed in in the Midwest, and I went to school at SMU. Then I got married. I was only 18 or 9. I was 19, and Joe was at A&M. And he was supposed to graduate school that spring, and he was in the Army Reserve along with many others, and they didn't allow him to finish school. And so they went into they were taken into the reserve at Mineral Wells. Most of those men that he went in with at the time, boys, have since passed away. Marvin Rubenstein, George Goldman, Marvin Mosesman. Morris Cohen was already, and he was stationed there in Mineral Wells, and Cousin Bess lived at the Baker Hotel.
It's pretty good. Very good. What was the community like when you got married? Well, let's back up. When you were a kid, can you give some insight as to what the community and your observance at home was like? And then go
My
from there?
family, my father was not an observant man, but whatever my mother wanted was fine with him. We had a very observant home. My dad met every stranger on the street that came to the market that didn't have a place to stay, put them in the truck and brought them home. Sophie, this man's going to stay with us until he can get on his feet.
Wait. I need to flip over here.
I'll put it on pause. So any man that he met on the market or wherever he met them, he brought them home until they were financially able to move into their own place. My mother made a few shidduchs, as a matter of fact, of women who hadn't married. And incidentally, when my mother married my father, she was just 15.
Oh my.
And she worked at Sanger's and went to school also. And Mr. Sanger told her she was too young to get married. She shouldn't get married. He treated her really lovely. And all her girlfriends, as she told us, made fun of her because she was marrying an immigrant. And that was a terrible thing to do. But she fared much better than the rest of them.
Mm-hmm. About what year was that?
They were married in 1917. And my brother was born in 1919.
How was it when you were living at home, as a young child? What were the holidays like? And what was it like living with your grandmother, or your grandmother being
It was
in the family?
wonderful. It's too bad. I have 9 lovely grandchildren myself, but it's nothing like that was. We were very respectful of her. We helped her. She had poor eyesight. My sister Mimi, who is 6 years younger than I am, she was a little girl. She used to help her get her clothes out, help her bathe, sit on the porch with her and swing, and they would sing little Jewish songs. And we had wonderful holidays. My mother always had all the Goodman family for Passover. Well, that was a big thing because they all had at least one or two of them had 2 children. Most of them had 3 or 4 children. Then when the grandmother and grandfather, when the grandmother died, the grandfather, I was 15, I think, when he died. He went to live with the oldest son, lived with him for a short period of time, and then went to live with the other son. And, but nobody did anything. We had wonderful summers, picnics, the whole family, at a park now. I think it's still there, but I believe it has an Oriental influence, called Kid Springs. It's a Japanese park in Oak Cliff. And every Sunday, everybody brought their own lunches, and we all sat together. The cousins of comparable ages played together. I used to walk. I didn't ride on Saturday. I used to walk on Saturday to meet my cousin Florence Smiley. She lived on Ackerd Street. Sometimes we'd walk downtown together and not buy anything. We'd just walk around and look around. And then we'd walk back to her house. I think altogether back to my house might have been 2 miles. But that was the big deal. We loved doing it. And some few of the men, boy cousins so to speak, stayed friends all their lives. Several of them worked for my dad and got their start, whatever they did. Various different cousins on the Goodman side and also on my mother's side. One of my mother's nephews, her brother's sister, who's now deceased, moved to California. Just recently at the Legacy, I met Mr. Ellentuck, is that his name? Mm-hmm. And I asked him if he knew my cousin Sam Venner in Palm Springs. He said he was my best friend, and he told me of all the wonderful things that he did for the community there, including locking the doors to the hall until everybody raised their pledge for the Federation in Palm Springs. And he told me that my cousin Sam told him that my father taught him everything he knew about business and about life. And he was always grateful. He had a wonderful life. He and his wife are both deceased now. But we all mingled. The first time I was in the company of boys and girls at a dance, well, at the temple they used to have temple dances about once a month on Saturday night. I can remember the fellow I danced with. I don't think he ever got married. I don't think because of that. But the Reform guys stood on one side of the room, the Orthodox girls on the other. Eventually, in 2 or 3 times, all that began to disappear.
Now, who organized those dances? How did they come about?
I think the temple, they were far ahead of their time in trying to keep the young people together and in the temple. And a lot of the families did go from generation to generation. But so did they at Sheriff Israel. I think so did they at Tifereth Israel. The Ramesha Shul, as they called it, was very small. The Wallman family belonged there. They always went there on the holidays, though the kids went to Sheriff Israel, to Sunday school and so forth. I don't know who organized the rest of them. At Agudas Achim, they had, nice Sunday school, a good group of kids. We used to have every kind of a picnic in our yard. Long after the synagogue closed. Mm-hmm.
Do you remember the year they closed it? Agudas
No,
Achim?
I don't. Let's see, I was married in 1943, and I would say about 5 or 6 years later. I think. I'm not positive.
57, I think.
Mm-hmm, something like that.
Yeah.
Rabbi Abram was retired. He was in poor health. He was still a young man by today's standards.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any special experiences that you remember about during your high school and even during your,
I remember
years at Brown School?
Well,
on Park
now
Road.
Everybody looks back and talk about Forest Avenue High School. Everybody was Jewish, but that wasn't so.
Mm-hmm.
That was not so. Annette and I went to a reunion a few years ago. We didn't know anybody that was there, hardly any of the Jewish. We went because they dedicated a library lounge to Harold Zeitman. He had been a teacher, and he went to Forest High School and helped a lot of young people. But that wasn't so. And at Brown School, I never experienced any anti-Semitism. We didn't really. In my family, we did move out of the Jewish circle because my dad and my mother. My dad was a Shriner and a Mason, and my mother was an Eastern Star. That's this ring. She was the only Jewish woman in there. It meant no cliff. I had to become a rainbow girl, which is the daughter of a Mason. I was the only Jewish person in there. I don't ever want to be the only Jewish person anywhere. But I don't also want not to be allowed to do something because of that. And when I went to college, the very first week I was in school, we had an interchange of dormitories, the boys and the girls, and I'm dancing with this fella. And in conversation, I can still feel the blood rush to my head now. He said, "I just hate Jews, don't you?" Now there I was, about 17 years old. First experience. I said, "Well, for your information, you're dancing with one." And I turned around and went to my room and didn't go back. I don't know that I've ever had any other. And my husband was very prominent in the Jewish community, as well as the civil community. Some of his best friends, as they used to say, were not Jewish, and he was dedicated to them and them to him. One of his best friends was Tom Eunice. He gave Joe that Moses on his 50th birthday, and they were Catholic. So we knew every Catholic minister in town because we went to everything they ever had. And also other people, as my husband participated in so many things. He was good friends of the Cullums, the Holts of Oak Cliff. I just can't tell you how many people. We were in their homes, they were in our home. And of course, as he went on to the legislature, every year we had a Texas OU game at our house. At one time we had 4 governors there. And when I'd ask him how many people we were going to have, he'd say 40. And so one time we had it and a bus pulls up in front. And the waiter, Blondale, comes in. He says, "Miss Golman, 75 people just pulled up. Are we going to have enough food?" I said, "I hope so," and we did. But he loved doing that. We never had any kind of experience like that.
Now, where did you live after you were married?
Well, you couldn't find an apartment after the war. There was none to be had.
Mm-hmm.
There were no homes to be had.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't have any money.
Mm-hmm.
He hadn't worked a day yet in his life.
Mm-hmm.
And his grandfather had passed away a few years before we married, about 4 or 5, I think. And he lived at 2420 Park Road. And my mother-in-law had the house leased out.
Mm-hmm.
So we had the people move. We bought the house on paper, didn't pay for it,
Mm-hmm.
and lived there for about 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
Till our second child, Julie, was born there. And John David, of blessed memory, he was born there. And then all the Jewish people started moving because the land for the temple and the Shereths were bought around the same time, and people wanted to move near their places of worship. So we bought a lot on LaBello Drive. My parents had moved on Sunnybrook, and everybody was beginning to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And so then my sister's mother-in-law, Ray Aronoff, every Saturday at my mother's house, not invited, everybody came to my mother's house on Saturday for lunch. I don't know how she knew how many people were going to be there. My mother-in-law was there, some of my aunts, Ray Aronoff, who was my sister's mother-in-law, other different various people. She said, I want you to go look at this house, Francis. It's just what you need. We already had our plans and everything. Mm-hmm. We went over there on Northport, and we decided to buy the house. It was just what we wanted. Mm-hmm. And we lived there, I think, about 23, 24 years.
Do you remember the year that you bought the house? When you moved to Northport?
I think Julie was 4. Julie is 59.
Okay. Now,
and John David was just about 2.
Mm-hmm. Now, what was life like with Joel of Shalom when you got married, and how did that develop, and how did he get into politics? And what did he do before that?
It developed because we lived behind each other. This is the truth.
Okay.
He called me for a date on Saturday night. I was 15 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And I told him thank you, but no thank you. When I hung up, my mother said, who was that? And I said, that was Joe Golman. She said, what did he want? I said, he wanted me to go to a movie on Saturday night. She said, what'd you tell him? I told him no. She said, well, you'll go. You'll hurt Esther's feelings. That was a fact. So after that, I guess you would say we were a couple. And he was busy in school. He went to A&M, and he graduated in the midterm also, and I did too. He went to SMU for part of that time and then after we got married, had a big wedding, I think about 600 people. Not all of them were cousins, but a lot of them were. And at the Baker Hotel. We went on our honeymoon, the war was on then, to New Orleans, on the train. When we came back, he had rented a house, I guess you'd call it a house, in College Station, right on the railroad track. And it had been an artist studio, and her husband was a general in Converse Rising Louis III, and he was overseas. She never knew where he was. So we rented this little house. It was about the size of half of this room. It was a bedroom, had a table and chairs in there, a little tiny kitchen, a little bathroom. And we lived there during that spring. And then he was called into service, so I came home. I stayed with my parents. I worked for a brief time. This is my working career at Neiman Marcus. I think they felt like they had to give me a job because I bought so many clothes there. And then when Joe went to took his basic training, where all these same fellas took their basic training in Paris, Texas, at Camp Maxey, and then they gave him the physical to go overseas, and they found out he had asthma. And he didn't go overseas. The rest of the boys did. George Goldman became a prisoner of war. The rest of them fought the whole war and came home. And then they were going to close Camp Fannin at Tyler, where he was stationed. We lived in an apartment, moved a couple of times because we had to give up where we were living. And the general, Joe, lost his commission because he couldn't go into the Army because of the asthma. And he was a master sergeant, and he was whatever, I don't even remember now, the head of the camp of that part of the service. Mm-hmm. And his general asked him to come with him to Atlanta. He said, what other choice would I have? He said, well, you could go to Dallas to Southwestern Medical Foundation. Oh, that's why I thought Joe thought he was a doctor, because he was there. It was the shacks, wooden buildings, and it was a good experience. We stayed at home with my folks at that time. We met some really fine Jewish people who we always had over. Mother had them all over the camps. Some of the different fellows that they had to the either Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or any holiday, Passover especially. Some of them came to my mother and dad's 50th wedding anniversary from various parts of the country. So all in all, he had a good experience there. And we got out of the service, he was only 21 years old. And his cousin, Julius Sheps, wanted him to run for city council. I said, you just started to work, you're just a boy, you don't have any money, you can't do that. But that didn't make any difference. He did it anyway. And then eventually, other people, he became very interested in politics. As a matter of fact, he had an honor, not at that time, but he had an honorary doctorate in political science from the University of Texas that was given to him when he was in the state legislature. So he filled out an unexpired term of a councilman who moved out of the state, and then he ran for that election unopposed, I think twice. One time he had an opposition, and then after that, he just was on every city board. He was awarded the Young Man of the Year. That's the first young Jewish boy on the Junior Chamber of Commerce. And I can't tell you, if you look on those, you'll see various honorary positions that he held. He just loved politics, and that was a hard thing because he was in the produce business. He got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, didn't come home till late. When he was elected to the legislature, about 65 people went down to see him sworn in. And then I realized I was going to be home by myself with the children. Julie was in school at the University of Texas at the time, and he would come home on Thursday or Friday and leave on Sunday. But he was very busy and very good in what he did, very honest. Was approached many times. I can see the presents he used to send back. People would send him thank you for doing it. But it was just something he felt like his duty and his job. He wouldn't take anything for any kind of guidance or anything. So it was a good experience. We met a lot of wonderful people. He also was selected the Rookie of the Year the first year he was in the state legislature. Basically, this is more about him and his life than me, because I was just a housewife, and I was active because I did things my mother told me I had to do, participate in the synagogue at the shul, and I worked with her, and along with my sister-in-law, my brother's wife, Ruth, my sister-in-law, Annette, my mother-in-law, and my mother did everything together. A lot of people thought they were sisters. They did everything together. They were very devoted to each other. And I helped my mother in organizing the Mizrahi chapter in Dallas, which Rabbi Abramowitz asked her to do. We raised thousands and thousands of dollars. It's not like it is now. People didn't have that kind of money, but they gave graciously from their heart. And I was the president, I don't know, about 4 times till enough is enough, you know. And in the meantime, I was an at-home mother. I was home when my kids came home from school. I lent my home for everything. I chauffeured every rabbi's wife that came for the position at Sheriff Israel around Dallas. We had dinner parties for them to interest them in coming to Sheriff Israel. Some of them were. Most of them just came because it was free. It's not nice, but it's a fact.
Did you have these parties at home?
Most of them. Sometimes we had them at home. Sometimes we had them at the Chaparral Club. I can't recall what year Joe was president. He was 43 at the time he was president. At that time, he was the youngest person who'd ever been president.
Now, this was of which?
Sheriff Israel. And so sometimes, I think we had them once or twice at the Colombian Club. But basically, I used to take them and show them the kosher butcher shop, show them the things of Jewish interest, and then take the wives around. Seems to me I did that a lot for other people too, like doctors who moved to Dallas and that sort of thing. I don't know how I got that job, but anyhow, it was fun and a good deed and a mitzvah.
Yeah.
We have to have more of those today.
Yeah.
And I think we have a lot of wonderful young people interested in the community.
What were some of the activities that the Ladies Auxiliary did at Agudas Achim, and then the things that you did at Sheriff Israel?
At Agudas Achim, it was an older generation. Don't forget I was young. And they had book reviews. They had bingo parties. They had shul dinners. They had the Hever Kadisha. That was entertainment in those days. At Sheriff Israel, they had the Hever. They don't have that anymore. The Hever Kadisha. I don't think they get the recognition they deserve. That's a really tough. And we had all kinds of programs. By that time, we had capable people who participated. At one time, Rabbi Silverman's wife, Devorah, did a big program that we had. And then after her, Rabbi, what was his name? With Muriel, his wife, Merle, his wife.
Shapiro.
Rabbi Shapiro's wife was also talented, did several good programs. We had other programs. We had also entertainment like that.
What kind of programs did they do?
At Sheriff Israel, some of them were Hanukkah programs. Some of them were around the holidays. I participated in some of the programs because speech had been my major in school. And I participated in those in grade school too, in programs like that. And then, as we became more knowledgeable, we got smarter, more educated women at Sheriff Israel, and the programs became more uplifting and rewarding, and they started the Women of Valor program. They started the, what is that where they do the woman, they just did Sharon Levine.
It's for the seminary,
Yeah,
fundraiser.
and various programs like that. To be frank, I haven't gone in several years. I think basically it's made up of younger people. It's time for them to do the work. I didn't do that kind of work at Sheriff Israel, really. I used to cook with my mother, my mother-in-law, my Aunt Sarah Goodman at Sheriff Israel, and set the tables. Well, you couldn't ask girls to do that today. They wouldn't have time or they wouldn't do it.
What kind of events did you cook for at Sheriff Israel?
Every luncheons, we never went to the Colombian Club. We had members who were Colombian Club members or other Lakewood Country Club or Athletic Club. We didn't do things like that. Things were done in the synagogue where, in my opinion, they belong, and in people's home. Plenty of people have large enough homes. I don't think I've been to any in recent years. I think they've had a few, but the ones that I've been to that have been in big homes have been either from the council, but it has not been from Sheriff Israel. I think they've had them, but they've had them previously to the demise of the Colombian Club. They had them there. But we set the tables, we washed the dishes. If we didn't have help, we cooked. That's why I can cook on a big scale even today.
What were the luncheons for? What were the
Sisterhood
events?
meeting, a regular
for the
monthly
meeting?
sisterhood meeting. Then
Okay.
a special event. A special event, they had a little nicer luncheon. We had decorating committees. We always had something pretty on the table, not outlandish, not like not like you go to a bar mitzvah today and it's a Hollywood production. I think that ought to be against the law. When my boys were bar mitzvah, and my daughter was among the first 5 or 6 that were bat mitzvah.
Mm-hmm.
At the bar mitzvahs, they only allowed them to serve tuna fish or gefilte fish. And you could put flowers on the table, but it was nothing like you see. Just think all that money could go to some wonderful cause. And at a regular sisterhood luncheon, they'd serve a hot lunch, a nice lunch, fish or chicken, or whatever, a regular full-course lunch. And at the dinners, we used to cook for the Hever Kadisha dinners. Have a wonderful, wonderful dinner. They had packed houses all the time. Mm-hmm. But this generation doesn't go in that direction. And frankly, I don't think our rabbis have encouraged that for many, many years. The last really huge thing I remember, I think Bess Cohen was the chairman of that, was it the 100th year anniversary of Shereth Israel? It was at one of the hotels, and it was huge, and they raised a lot of money for that. But they don't do that anymore. Mm-mm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, what is your affiliation? What has that been over the years? You talked about a Good Asachim and Shereth Israel. Were there any other shuls that you were affiliated with?
No, we didn't belong to other shuls. My mother-in-law still went to the Tifereth Israel as long as she lived in South Dallas. Mm-hmm. But she went to Shereth Israel one day and to Rosh Hashanah, and one day to Tifereth Israel. And we didn't belong to other synagogues. We belonged to many organizations, both Jewish, civic, non-Jewish, participated in a lot of things.
What was the Colombian Club like at that point in time?
Well, at the time that we joined with many other families.
Give me a date or an idea.
I can't
Era?
give you an idea. I
Era?
don't remember. Wait a minute. Yes, I think I can. It must be about 42 years that we belonged to the Colombian Club. And so they didn't want any Shereth Israel, God forbid, any of the other Tifereth Israel members, but they wanted to build the new country club. And so they needed the money. I wasn't much in favor of us joining, not because of the money, because I didn't take care of that, but because I felt like our children were to grow up in a different atmosphere. But the Wallmans, the Donskys, Harry Kaplan, various others, Manny Hoppenstein, various others from the other synagogues joined. I don't know how many at that time. But they were very warm. First of all, we grew up with most of those people. They wanted your money, so they became whatever. So we participated in everything.
Wait a minute.